everyone, and good afternoon. It's a pleasure being the moderator of this important session. My name is Stewart Kwoh. I'm the President Emeritus of Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Los Angeles. I'm a longtime C100 member. I worked on the Vincent Chen case. I was the only out-of-state co-counsel to the Mothers Group, advocating for federal hate crimes prosecution against the killers. I have been working on hate crimes for 37 years, and I've been president of the LA City Human Relations Commission, and I've spoken to Human Relations commissioners throughout the country. It's a pleasure joining you today. The New York experiment on creating an Asian hate crimes task force is an important development for our community. It has negative and positive possibilities, but we want to explore what those possibilities are with all of you. We want to thank all of you for joining us. We have over 200 people on the webinar today, over 20 community organizations. And before I thank people and introduce our speakers, let me just say that if you have any questions, please type it in the Q&A box, and we will try to get to them at the end of our session, about an hour from now. Let me start off by thanking our New York City Police Foundation, the Starr Foundation, and a special thanks to our C100 member, Rick New, for helping make this town hall possible. And I want to thank the Committee of 100 for their deep interest in this very important issue. I want to thank the NYPD, and in particular, Commissioner Shea, Deputy Inspector Molinari, and Deputy Inspector Loo for taking the time to connect with the community on the Asian Hate Crimes Task Force. Let me introduce each of the speakers all together, and then I'll have each of them say a few words, which will take about 20 minutes. First of all, I want to introduce Dermot Shea. He's the NYPD Commissioner. He was appointed in 2019. He has served as Chief of Detectives of the NYPD. He has been the Chief of Crime Control Statistics and Strategies. He's been the Deputy Commander of Operations. Dermot Shea, his parents immigrated from Ireland in the 1950s and then met in New York and had Dermot. Dermot is a dedicated police reformer. He's a proponent of the NYPD working in close partnership with all its residents, but in particular with the community-based organizations, with a special focus on helping young people steer clear of a first act of criminal behavior. So we will hear from Commissioner Shea in just a moment. I'd also like to introduce Deputy Inspector Mark Molinari. He's the command officer of the NYPD Hate Crimes Task Force. He's a 23-year career veteran in the NYPD. As head of the Hate Crimes Task Force, he oversees 18 detectives and 5 supervisors. I think you should know that this is the largest dedicated law enforcement unit for hate crimes investigations in the United States of America. And last but not least, let me introduce Deputy Inspector Stewart Loo. I like Stewart. I liked him right away because he has the same first name I do. But he heads the Asian Hate Crime Task Force. He was born in Taipei. He's emigrated as a child in 1983. He's a 20-year veteran of the NYPD. In 2013, he was promoted to captain and has worked in the detective bureaus in Manhattan. He's committed to serving He's committed to representing Asian Americans to provide a positive influence for the community and for future generations. Then after these three officers present, we will start off the questions with three community leaders. Don Lee, Board Chair of the Homecrest Community Services, Brian Chen, Chief Strategy Officer of the Chinese American Planning Council, and Joanne Yu, the Executive Director of Asian American Federation. All three very important organizations. So let me start off with Dermot Shea, the NYPD Commissioner, and have him say a few words on the importance of the NYPD Asian Hate Crimes Task Force. Dermot?
Yep. So Stewart, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today to everyone on this webinar certainly from across the entire country and beyond. You mentioned and you introduced Inspector Loo and Inspector Molinari. Those are the subject matter experts. I can tell you, you touched on it, that we have the largest hate crimes task force in the country. And I'll let them tell the story, but Inspector Molinari has been the commanding officer of our hate crimes task force for a number of years. And I would like to just commend the two of them and our Chief of Detectives, Rodney Harrison, but in particular, Inspector Loo, because earlier this year, Inspector Loo has a day job and he's very busy in the island of Manhattan solving crimes. But he identified a gap that we had here in New York City in terms of how do you take a well-oiled machine, the hate crimes task force, and how do you identify a gap that we have and how do you make it better? And by reaching across the NYPD, we are the most diverse police department in the country, and tapping the resources that we had here on hand already. How do we build that bridge with the community members that may be experiencing hate crimes in New York City from across the Asian heritage? And still, I mean, publicly, privately, I've said it, but publicly, I'll commend you for the work that you did in really bringing this to fruition. It speaks to everything that we try to do here in New York in terms of bringing people together, identifying that we had a problem, but more importantly, what's the solution to it? And I'll turn it over to Mark, Stewart, with your lead, whoever you want to hear from first. But they've really come up with an innovative program. I heard you mention there's positive and negative. I'm curious about the negative, but it's really shown some good progress in the initial stages here in terms of connecting to victims of crime that maybe we were missing before. So I'll turn it to you, Stewart.
Let's hear from Detective Inspector Mark Molinari first, and then we'll go to Inspector Loo. Mark?
Yes, excellent, Stewart. Thank you. And Commissioner, thank you. Yes, I'm Mark Molinari. I'm the commanding officer of the NYPD Hate Crime Task Force. As was already mentioned, we are the largest hate crime unit of any law enforcement organization in the country. There are about 18,000 law enforcement agencies in this country, and about 6 or 8 of them have a unit dedicated specifically to hate crimes. They'll all investigate them, but they're also linked in with other crimes or other units of investigation. We have the largest and we have the second oldest. This New Year's Eve is going to be the 40-year anniversary of the NYPD having a specific hate crime unit. Now, it's important to note the hate crime law that I'm going to talk about was signed into New York State law in the year 2000. So that means for 20 years, the NYPD was on the forefront investigating hate crimes, documenting, investigating, and tracking them without a law to fully prosecute on. We do have 25 members in the Hate Crime Task Force. We are a response investigative unit. So after incident, when something happens, we are called in. The NYPD takes hate crimes very, very seriously. And from the initial incident, the initial reporting of a victim coming forward to law enforcement, this rises to the executive level. A captain or above has to be involved, and they make the notifications over to my office. We work with many different units in the department and outside of the department. As I said, we are an investigative after incident unit. I get to be the voice and face of the unit, and I get to do presentations such as this. I've done these with the police commissioner before, the chief of detectives, our community affairs bureau and our chief of community affairs, our federal partners in the FBI and the DOJ, New York State Police, New Jersey State Police, and city agencies, the DA's offices, and the mayor's office. So I get to be involved in presentations like this. And we've done these, I'm here over 3.5 years, and I've done these since my first day in the unit. We've always tried to do as much interaction with the communities as possible and getting our message out there. I'm going to add some links after my presentation into the chat box for people to see, but if we basically describe what a hate crime is, it's a crime that is motivated, at least mostly by, it's at least motivated by substantially, I'm sorry, I'm getting some feedback there. The crime is motivated by the person's, the victim's, the person or place, their membership in a certain identity group. And we are all a victim. We are all involved in an identity group. Your race, gender, national origin, sexual orientation, religion and religious practice, for example, disabilities, age is involved in that. So that is the basic reason for hate crime law. It is a extension on the crime that happens to get increased investigation, increased prosecution, and increased sentencing. Before I move forward to the presentation, something I always put into these is the need for reporting. Any statistic I'm going to give you is based on reported incidents. All crimes to me should be reported. All hate crimes definitely should be reported. Call 911 on any crimes. To me, it's a humanitarian issue that we owe it to the rest of New Yorkers, the rest of Americans, that we have to, when we are the victim of a crime, we have to do something about that to prevent future victims of crimes by the same person. We have to be able to identify that perpetrator. The big question I always get is about immigration. We do not ask any questions about immigration status. The NYPD will never ask about it. Immigration status does not play into this investigation at all. If you're a victim of a crime, we are here to help you. So looking at some quick stats that I'll give you, it's important to note that last year we had an increase in hate crimes in the city against all different identity groups. We were up 20% at the end of last year. As of early March this year, we were down 22%. We were already doing a great job in the city with preventing and apprehending those who commit hate crimes. We recognized what this problem was going to be when the COVID pandemic started, and we saw that it was going to be a reason for people to lash out at communities, and specifically the Asian community. As of right now, we are down 33% in hate crimes in the city against all identity groups. But what we do see, obviously, is these COVID-related crimes. As of right now, we have 23 COVID-related hate crimes. One of them affected the Jewish community, and the other 22 affected the Asian community. We've made arrests in 15 out of those 23 cases, and we're still working on the rest. Bringing my friend Stu Loo into this, early on, our first case came in on March 10th, and we solved 6 out of the 8 cases very quickly in the first month of COVID. And we're very happy. 75% success rate is pretty good in this business. The other 2 cases we couldn't solve because the victims did not want to speak to us. They were intimidated by the police, cultural issues, fear of immigration, whatever their reason was, they didn't want to work on the investigation. So we had 2 cases that could not be solved. Stu Loo, working with Chief Detectives Rodney Harrison, came up with this idea that what might help these investigations is creating this liaison unit. Right off the bat, they worked on one of those 2 cases and helped us solve it. So right there on the first 8, we solved 7 out of 8 quickly. Moving forward, what we do with this unit, as the police commissioner mentioned, Stu Loo has a day job. All of the people in this Asian hate crime task force, they're volunteers into this liaison group, into this assistance group, that the work they do for me. All hate crimes come to my office. But when I have somebody who might have a language barrier or a cultural barrier or a fear of police, I reached out to Stu Loo, and he has a listing of volunteers. Again, they're people who work, they're investigators in the police department. They work in the Intelligence Bureau, in counterterrorism, in different detective bureau functions. They're out working stabbings and robberies and shootings. But when I reach out to Stu, he gets me the name of somebody who speaks the language and comes from the same area, the same nation as my victim. That person partners up with my detective, and they go out and work the case together. So I could talk a lot more about it, but Mr. Kwoh, and with the police commissioner's permission, I really think Stu Loo's feedback and input into this would be perfect at this time.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Inspector. Why don't we turn to Deputy Inspector Loo to answer some of those questions.
Thank you, Stewart. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Commissioner Shea, for those kind words. So it was well said, Mark. This unit is a support unit for the overall hate crimes task force. And why did we form this? So as everyone knows, during COVID-19 pandemic, and Mark foresaw this whole thing. He foresaw a spike in hate crimes. And back in February, he knew this was going to happen. I unfortunately did not see this coming. This came to my attention, not through stats, but anecdotally. My wife told me that she's afraid to go out because she's actually scared. I'm sent videos from social media, links. I'm hearing stories of friends, family members of being harassed on the train, in the street. So I knew there was a problem. In April, Chief Harrison had a town hall meeting addressing this issue. And it's no secret that serving the Asian community has always been difficult. It's always been a challenge. Language barrier, cultural differences. I saw this firsthand. When I came to America in 1983, my dad took a job delivering Chinese food. Of course, he was victim of a crime several times. They tried stealing his bike, they tried stealing his money, they tried stealing the food that he was delivering. And depending on which officer showed up, you get a varying degree of service. It's just the language barrier is very hard to overcome, and so is the cultural differences. But that's always been an issue. And because the rise of the hate crimes against Asian Americans during this pandemic, it kind of brought light to this gap, this investigative gap, this bridge that, that we need to bridge to connect to our victims. And unlike the early 80s, we actually have the personnel to mitigate these difficulties. So Mark spoke about over 20-something cases since March, but it's not really about those 20-something cases. It's more about the crimes that goes unreported. We formed this unit so we can get the right people with the specific skill set to do the job. We have translated in the department where we cannot. I was a certified translator when I first came on the job, and I helped in many investigations. And as a translator, you couldn't build that rapport with the victim. The detective couldn't build that rapport. He had to use a different translator every time. So myself with Chief Harrison put together this task force that takes qualified, certified translators with investigative background, which bridges the gap and fixes the difficulties between the victim and the investigator. That rapport between the victim and the investigator could be the difference between making or breaking the case. So who is part of this task force? I have 25, right now I have 5 supervisors and over 25 detectives, all first-generation Asian Americans who speak a second language: Mandarin, Cantonese, Fukienese, Shanghainese, Thai, Vietnamese, of 10 different languages spoken. They all come from the community to serve the community. These detectives, like Mar had said earlier, they're assigned to various units all over the city. This task force is not an additional resource that we're throwing in there. It's volunteers, people who are handling a bigger caseload because they want to hang out. I mean, they want to help out. But what do we actually do? Mark was saying all the cases ultimately gets called into his office. And when he has a case that requires a special skill set, he'll call me. And that's where I'll dispatch my detectives. And it's not just hate crime cases. Hate crime is the impetus of creating this task force, but we will help on any case. Certain cases which is not considered hate crime, but may be perceived as a hate crime, like that case in Brooklyn where the lady was set on fire. That on the surface may seem like a hate crime, But in fact, it was something completely different. And we got involved in that case because it was the same issue. No matter what the crime is, whether it's hate crime or not, we run into the same issues with Asian victims. It's the language barrier, the cultural differences, the reluctance to make the report. This lady only made the report because her family had convinced her to do it. And once she made the report, she was very hesitant to follow through with the investigation. So I sent one of my young detectives over who spoke in her language, and she opened up and she was able to give us a full story, detailed description, and she became very cooperative. That was the difference in solving that case. We made 2 arrests on that. That wasn't a hate crime. But the point is that we're not just about hate crimes. We're about putting the right people to solve the crime with that special skill set. We also help any unit that requests our help. We will help them, whether it's special victims, financial crimes, robbery squad. A couple of weeks ago in the 109 precinct, we had a female shot. She was collecting cans. While she was collecting cans, somebody fired a round and hit her in the head. Luckily, she survived with a small caliber round, didn't penetrate her skull. But there was difficulty. She didn't speak English. It was a predominantly Asian neighborhood. We had to look for additional witnesses and collect video. A lot of people that don't speak English. So it's very tough to send a detective to look for these witnesses and video when they don't speak the language. So I sent my guys out there. We did an interview. We collected video for them. And the case is still not solved, but it's coming together. But why is this all very important? This is important because we're getting the right people to do the job. And because of that, we're doing a better job. Okay, but more important than that, it shows that the police department recognizes that there is a problem, and we're taking a proactive approach. We're reaching out. We're trying to solve the problem before it gets worse. And it's agreed that we put this task force together because this thing might get bigger than we can handle later on. It brings awareness to the issue, to mainstream media. And awareness leads to education, which eventually I hope leads to change. Okay. It brings hope to the victim as well. I've reached out personally to many victims, and just by me reaching out and telling them what we're doing and who we are, they're very happy, they're very appreciative. And that's very important because some of these victims they're traumatized by the incident that's happened to them. And bringing justice is the first step to making them whole again. And so far, we've had success. I have nothing but positive feedback from every single victim I spoke to, every community organization, people within the department, people outside the department, other agencies that I spoke with. And the case that Mark spoke about earlier, where there was the transit case where the victim completely did not want to come forward, not even a report was taken. We reached out, we located our victim, and we were able to gain cooperation. And it was because of the people on the task force, because they care and they have the language skill set and they have the background for it.
Thank you, Inspector Loo. Why don't we turn to 3 planned questions that we had heard ahead of time, and then I'll get to the 10 questions we've already gotten from the audience. So Don, do you want to ask your question? And then followed by Brian, Chen, and Joanne Yu. Don?
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. First, thank you very much. Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, C100. So my question is this. What factor does the NYPD take into consideration when classifying a crime as a hate crime? And what specific factors does the NYPD use in order to charge a perpetrator with a hate crime? And the reason why I'm asking about this is because the grandma case, and we're talking about a different grandma case. She was burned, slapped. Her family is a native English speaker. When they went to the police station, they were told to go home and call 911. And then after that, you know, everyone in the community, including the victim, believed this is a hate crime. We were told that because nothing was spoken, therefore it is not a hate crime. The other thing is that there were 2 other recent cases, one in Staten Island, where racial slurs were spoken against an Arab American, and that was also not classified as a hate crime. And the most recent case where the Japanese pianist was attacked, where there were racial slur, again, were spoken, that's also not classified as a hate crime. So we just want to know, my question is, what factors does the NYPD take into consideration, and what specific factor does it need to charge someone with a hate crime? And does it have to be happening contiguous to the crime, or do they do more investigations?
Yeah, Mark, I'll push it to you in a second. I'll tee that up. The short answer is you have to have a crime take place, number one, first and foremost. And then it becomes a question of, and it's not always easy, but the concept is the crime took place. Why did the crime take place? What motivation was there for this crime to take place? And is it a robbery that took place because somebody needed money? But did they target a specific person? Whether it's Jewish, whether it's anti-Black, whether it's, in this case, Asian. Did they target a particular group or class of people and do that crime specifically for that purpose? I will, before I turn it over to Mark Molinari, bring up one other point. Anytime that we have an arrest in New York City, we have 5 different district attorney's offices in New York City. And each of those district attorney's offices, working in collaboration with us, screen those cases. So it is not always clear cut. It is not always black and white. I could tell you that we've had cases where we believe it's a hate crime, but the district attorney doesn't want to charge it as a hate crime. And sometimes actually the reverse happens too. And sometimes it's a case of totality of circumstances, statements made. It could be social media history. It could be statements by the victim or witnesses. And all of that comes together to really make the case. And just as importantly, to prove it. And Mark, I'll let you finish up.
Excellent, Commissioner. Thank you. Yes, absolutely everything the Commissioner said. As I mentioned with the hate crime law, the verbiage in it, and I did add it onto the chat box, says that the crime is motivated in whole or substantial part by the identity of the victim. So if we think about 100%, 51% of the reason why the person committed that crime against that person is the identity of the person. The Commissioner used the example, if somebody is robbed, if it was a financial gain crime, the overarching, the percentage of the reason for the crime is the robbery. Who they pick is a subpart to that. I do work with the district attorney's office. Actually, let me back up. I also added in the NYPD patrol guide procedure into the chat box on how we determine hate crimes. Rising to the executive level, coming to my office, yes, I do have final say on what is a hate crime and what is not, based on a conferral with the chief detectives, but that's a very short answer. The longer answer is not, the short answer is not that Mark wakes up and decides if it is or it isn't. I work with the NYPD Legal Bureau. I work with federal partners also, and I work with those district attorneys on a first name basis, 24 hours a day, on what we need to prove this is a hate crime, and do we have enough motivating factors to say that this was done because of the identity of the victim. The gentleman mentioned 3 cases, the Chinese grandmother case that Inspector Loo mentioned also. Just as an aside, I see somebody in the chat box wrote about it must be a hate crime because who carries kerosene around? There was no kerosene involved in that case. That's an inaccurate fact that went out there. This was motivated by them being on the property. I can't go too far into it because they are juveniles and it is still a pending case, but we have to look at identity substitution. Would the perpetrators have done this if the victim wasn't Asian? Possibly. Would they have done it if she was a different age? Possibly. We can't just look at the fact of her age and her identity as the reason why this happened. The other cases mentioned, I know somebody mentioned the Japanese pianist up in northern Manhattan. There were other circumstances in that. Working with the DA's office, the hate crimes bureau chief for the Brooklyn DA's office always goes into a story of what are the factors before our crime happens. Let's take into a case a road rage example, and people are cutting each other off. Maybe there's a car accident, maybe there's not. Cutting each other off, cursing at each other. They pull to the side of the road and engage in an argument. Then it turns into a physical assault, and during that assault, somebody uses a slur. What is the motivating factor for that assault to happen? Is it the identity of the person, or is it the fact that they just engaged in this road rage accident and they're already fighting with each other? So I think I answered most of that. Commissioner, if you want me to jump in on something else, or anybody from the panelist board.
Detective Loo, do you want to comment? Well, why don't we move on to Brian? We covered one. Why don't we go to the next person? Brian?
Thank you to the C100 for organizing, Stewart for moderating, and Commissioner Shea, Deputy Inspectors Molinari and Loo for participating. As Stewart mentioned, I work with the Chinese American Planning Council in New York City, and we are the nation's largest Asian American social services nonprofit, serving 60,000 Asian Americans, immigrants, and low-income New Yorkers each year. So back in January, our organization began a multi-pronged approach to address the anti-Asian discrimination, harassment, and xenophobia associated with COVID-19. Including a campaign to remind New Yorkers that this pandemic is a public health issue and not a racial, ethnic, or immigrant issue. So with the formation of the newly created task force, how can community-based organizations like ours best partner with the newly formed task force to ensure that Asian American communities we support are both informed and empowered to escalate their concerns safely and securely? So in other words, what would a successful partnership between our community-based organizations and the newly formed task force look like? Thank you.
Inspector Loo, do you want to answer that question?
Sure, thank you for that question. A very good question. How can we work together to move forward to get the word out? So I think Zoom meetings like this, I think community-based meetings, whether it's in person or online, that's a very good start. I think having a social media presence, which the Asian Hate Crime Task Force does not have right now, I think creating one, which I plan to do, and partnering up with the various organizations and getting the word out through social media, that's going to be a big thing. Partnering up with certain media corporations and getting our word out there, going through DCPI. You know, we do a lot of good work here, but if it doesn't get out there to let people know what we're doing, it doesn't really matter. So I think getting the word out is very important, and working together through social media and meetings and getting together, that's a great start.
Yeah, Brian, if I could jump in there too, and you know, this has been a year that, you know, we've all tried to pull through together. Ups and downs, certainly, but when you look at where we are in New York City, for the most part, we're starting in some areas to get a little sense of normalcy and back to work. I would just challenge everyone on this message, and I will, you can get in touch with Inspector Molinari and Inspector Loo, and then they can feed it to me, but I would not restrict it just to the Hate Crimes Task Force or the Asian Hate Crimes Task Force. We have, you know, 77 precincts in New York City, each of them with neighborhood policing officers that their job is to engage with the community. So, you know, you working in New York City and bringing this to our attention here and asking how do we work better, closer together, we could force multiply this in terms of, if you get in touch with Inspector Molinari or Inspector Loo and tell us, you know, as long as there is no restrictions in terms of COVID and what we're going through in certain parts of the city right now in gatherings. But if you have community meetings that you're taking place, whether they're actual or, as Stu said, virtual, we could have local precinct people there. We could have representatives from the Asian Task Force there. And we can do, I think, quite a bit of good in terms of, number one, meeting, talking, developing relationships with each other. And then from there, there's a lot of opportunity, because whether it's things that the police department can do for different groups in this city, things that the police department can offer outside of hate crimes. Stu mentioned our Deputy Commissioner of Public Information. We would love to partner with different groups to, on an ongoing basis, develop relationships that will serve us well after this pandemic is over.
The next question is from Joo Han of the Asian American Federation. And she is working closely with Joanne Yu, the executive director. Joo Han.
Yes, hi. Thank you everybody for convening this briefing, and I represent the Asian American Federation. We are a leadership organization that has about 70 Asian nonprofits in our membership, and we work to highlight the most critical needs of the Asian community in New York City. So much like CPC, the Asian American Federation has been coordinating a response to the spike in hate crimes. And for us, the first signal of that was when our small businesses in Flushing were experiencing a rapid drop in customers due to the xenophobia that was related to COVID-19 and in Asian New Yorkers. And you know, since then there has been, I think we've been collecting reports of bias incidents and, you know, on our reporting platform, and talking with a lot of our member groups. And we know that the incidents continue. Even if the reports aren't necessarily being made, the majority of folks who have come to our site to report have not formally reported to the NYPD because they're not comfortable. So I do want to know, what I want to ask on behalf of the Federation is, what is a step-by-step process for reporting to determine when an act is not a hate crime? And I guess a follow-up question to that is, how much is a pattern of behavior taken into account during hate crimes? If the perpetrator has a track record of having done something, of sort of harassing someone based on their identity, but hasn't necessarily, nothing has actually been designated as a hate crime.
I'll open that up, and Mark, I'll pass it to you. And Stu, Stu mentioned this before. We're talking about hate crimes here, but I would challenge everyone that the reporting of crime in general, whether it is a hate crime or it is a crime that may not eventually be considered a hate crime, if we don't know about it, it is a big problem for the NYPD. So I think with the last question, with this question, the opportunity and the challenge in front of us is to develop those relationships, to build trust, yes, so that people actually feel comfortable coming to the police and know what's available. And then we get into a situation where once we know what's going on, we have a darn good police force and detective bureau that can actually work to solving some of these crimes. Mark, you want to touch on the pattern of activity that sometimes goes into determining a hate crime?
Sure, absolutely, boss. Real quick before that, as I said before, I put up the NYPD procedure on hate crimes into the chat box. So I think, Ms. Han, your question was about reporting and determining hate crime or not, the first question you asked. And as I said, a person comes in contact with the police. So whenever they're, the police are interviewing them, if they determine it might be possibly biased, they have to call a supervisor to the scene. Where that supervisor feels that it might be possibly biased, they have to call an executive to the scene. That executive has to send a report to me, whether they determine it to be a hate crime or not. We don't want it slipping through the cracks. So they could do their determination based on their experience, based on their training, on whether it's a hate crime or not. The pattern of behavior is actually interesting. We had two cases recently. Give you a little more information on it. So we're covered by the First Amendment here in the United States. We have free speech no matter how offensive it is, as long as it doesn't involve a threat. So without the threat, offensive free speech is just that. But we have looked at two cases recently, one in Staten Island and one recently, I think it's in Manhattan. Staten Island was anti-all different identities, and the one, I think it's in Manhattan, was against somebody's sexual orientation. And it was because of the repeated incidents that we were able to take a stalking case on that and turn it into stalking as a hate crime. So we could take that offensive free speech and add all the incidents of that together and come up with the stalking charge as a hate crime.
Breakdown in Staten Island. All right. It's 18 compared to
Inspector Loo, do you want to comment?
So let me add to that. So at the end of the day, and we discussed this in length, hate crimes are for the most part subjective. It's how you interpret the actions of the perpetrator. What is his motivation? How do we really know what his motivation is unless he outright says it? So no matter what we label it as hate crime or not a hate crime, there is a crime, and we are taking that crime regardless what the motivation is. We're taking that crime seriously, and we are investigating it with all our resources. And if it turns out that when we speak with the perpetrator at the end of the day, and he tells us he did this A, B, C, and D because of the race of our victim, then we will charge that. But we are kind of held, like Commissioner Shea said, we have 5 district attorneys that we present cases to. And they find different things, you know, it's subjected to what they feel like too. That's what they can prove. So regardless of what we label things at, it's the underlying crime is still there. We're still investigating that crime. Like, I know people are harping on why is that grandmother who was set on fire a hate crime? She was set on fire. That's a heinous crime in of itself. We're going to investigate that crime. But charging that extra charge of hate crime, we'll do it if we can, but we still need evidence. We're held to that standard, that evidentiary standard. We need to have proof that it is a hate crime. And a lot of times it's subjective. It's like, you know, we can't really say what the motivating factor is. So that's the challenges of taking hate crime cases.
Thank you. What I would like to do is comment on some of the questions we've received from the audience. And I know we don't have time to answer each one of them, but maybe you could listen to the questions, inspectors and commissioner, and just comment on whatever you can. And then we will have to continue this discussion much further later on. I got 15 questions, so let me just read them off. Number one, if you classify 2 criminal acts, one being non-hate and one being hate, do you only classify the non-hate crime and prosecute that? Or do you look at both? Do you have any opinions on the political inflammatory comments from our current president? And would things change if we have a new administration? Third, people did want an update on the Japanese American pianist, Uno, and what is being done. I think you did answer the 4th question, how many cases have been prosecuted and investigated? I think you said about 20. 5th, how fast can you investigate? Because people aren't just going to sit around. They're going to want to see some action. How fast can you investigate? 6th question is, if there's no racist statement, but people are pretty sure there was some racial animus behind the hate incident, what can people do? 7th question is, how do we protect our seniors from attacks, large and small? Number 8, LA County has a 24/7 211 number, hate LA versus hate initiatives. Can New York do the same? 9th question, which is very important, is on budget resources. Is there an appropriate budget for the important work that you're doing? Or should there be some budgetary allocation so that the officers in your task force can focus on the hate crimes rather than all the other cases they have? Number 10, how do we encourage victims to report if if the victim's identity and the accused identity are made known publicly? How do you encourage victims to continue to report? I think you answered the 11th question. How do you work with AAPI organizations? They are interested in outreach efforts. How do you make that really happen? 12th question is, many cases are dismissed, and what can victims do? Can they file harassment charges online? Or, you know, if the victim feels that their case is not paying attention to, what can they do? 13th question is, what are your service needs? Do you need interpreters? Do you need a mobile app to provide language and dialect interpretation? What kind of services do you need? 14th question is, where are the incidents happening in New York? Should we be vigilant about the cases happening in certain areas? 15th question is very important also. How do you bridge the gap between Asian American communities and other ethnic communities? How do you get employers and other communities to take anti-Asian violence very seriously and put that on par with other violence against other ethnic minorities? By the way, in Los Angeles, we formed a coalition for Better LA, where Black and Asian and soon-to-be Latino groups are supporting each other in the fight against violence against our communities. So we go out of our way to support what Blacks are feeling. And on the other hand, Blacks are supporting Asians with what they're confronting. So these are all the questions that have come up. Why don't you take a stab at answering a few of them? We have about 10 minutes. And then I know you can't answer all of them, but take a stab at answering a few of them. And then this calls for a greater conversation as we go on. Perhaps in 2 or 3 months, we'll come back together and answer the rest of the questions. But Inspector Loo and Inspector Molinari, you have indicated people could contact you as well. So Inspector Loo, do you want to take a stab at some of those questions?
Sure, of course. All very good questions. Is it listed somewhere in the chat? My memory's not the greatest.
Well, we'll write them up later.
Okay. Well, you asked a lot of questions. One was additional resources. Would it help if there's additional funding? That of course will always help. Well, I'll never turn down funding or resources. I'm talking about ideas or about organizations where you can create a working relationship with other ethnicities. Yeah, we have the Community Affairs Bureau here in NYPD, and we have events where we have all communities come, and kids. We have events for kids. So that's something like the one that you talked about, Better LA. Maybe we create something similar over here and just follow after that model.
Could you answer
some of the questions that you asked earlier? Because
what do you do with victims who don't feel they're being listened to and are turned away? What would you advise them to do?
So that's a big issue. And somebody brought it up that the grandmother went into the precinct and she was turned away. That's not what we want. That's not what we do. That's not the norm. Okay. And being very dismissive to our victims about when they report a crime, that's also something that we don't do. I know it happens here and there, but that is not the norm. And there was an issue last week that I ran into personally where I can't go too much into the case because it's still active, but she was verbally harassed while she was at work. The lady had come into the store and called her racial slurs, and the lady was very aggressive, and she chased after the victim. The victim was extremely scared. She was afraid that she was going to be assaulted. She ran around and she actually tripped and ended up in the hospital. She called security. Security apprehended the lady that chased her. A bunch of anti-Asian slurs was thrown at the victim, and she wanted her arrested. And when the police came, they couldn't piece it together. They couldn't figure out that there was a crime committed, some sort of aggravated harassment or menacing. And the security guard actually let that lady go. And she ended up not having a report made. She ended up in the hospital and she was badly injured. She went home and called the local precinct. Local precinct sent the report in to the precinct of occurrence. What happened was they incorrectly classified that event as a harassment, which is not really a crime, it's a violation, and we can only take action if we see it in person. And the reporting officer incorrectly told her that detective will contact you, which no one did because it's a closed case. She reached out to an activist and a community leader, and they reached out through channels, and they got to me, and I actually talked to her, and we were able to square everything away, and now we have a good suspect for her case. So if you get turned away, don't go, try again, go through a community leader. I have my information out there. People can contact me direct. We'll sort it out.
Thank you, Inspector Loo. I've gotten a few calls just recently. Judy is one of them. She's on the call today, and her mother has been assaulted, and she wasn't sure what to do, but she will contact you probably tomorrow.
Okay, very good.
Inspector Molinari, and then we'll have Commissioner Shea make a few closing remarks. Inspector Molinari?
Yes, thank you. I wrote down some of the questions and I'm scrolling through the question box here. Some of the big ones I saw that you highlighted, somebody asked about the speed of the case. How quickly can we do this? My answer is, of course, as quickly as possible. But working in the hate crime task force and our work with the DA's office, we don't want to build a okay case to present to the DA's office and risk losing it. We work directly with the DA's from day one of an investigation so that we can build a strong prosecution. We don't build to make an arrest. We build to make a prosecution. We want to see this actually go and succeed in court. That may delay it a little bit, but we work as quickly as possible. One thing I think of all the questions here, one of the things I glanced over that a few people are asking is the cases that I spoke about. 23 cases in New York City, COVID-related hate crimes. People are asking, so I can just give you numbers. 2 of them were in the Bronx, 5 were in Brooklyn, 3 were in Queens, and 13 were in Manhattan. Now, the 13 in Manhattan is obviously the largest number there. It's more than half of them, but those were scattered everywhere from the southern end of Manhattan to the northern tip of Manhattan, and only 2 of those incidents were committed by the same person who was apprehended soon after. People are asking about some other demographics. Our victims, 15 were male, 11 were female. The ages of those victims go from 18 to 59. Of the crimes committed, 7 of them were assault, a criminal mischief for broken property, a grand larceny for a stolen phone, and 2 menacings for threatening somebody with an object. The other 12 were the link that I added in, aggravated harassment second degree, which is the attempting, threatening, or making physical contact without an injury based on the identity of the person. So that's a large majority. That's more than half of our cases were those aggravated harassments. Dare I say, luckily, they weren't violent, there weren't crimes that involved an injury, but it's that same threat against somebody, threatening to strike somebody based on the identity of the person.
Thank you, Inspector. Why don't we turn to Commissioner Shea to make a last couple minute remarks to close out the panel. Commissioner Shea?
Stewart, thank you very much. And to everyone that joined today, thank you for the invitation and thank you for participating. Certainly, Inspector Loo, Inspector Molinari as well. I mean, obviously you could hear from them today. They are the true subject matter experts and they live this, and more than just being experts in their field of expertise, they genuinely care and work to find justice for victims. So for that, thank you. Just a couple closing thoughts. Translation has come up a couple times. One of the questions was, could we have an app? We actually have an app on our department issued smartphones that allows for translation. We also have a language line that allows people that are crime victims and officers to join together with translators. But I think that both Inspector Molinari and Inspector Loo said it very well. Sometimes it's much more than having a translator. It's about building that rapport. And the strength of the program that they are pioneering here is that it's not just a translator, it's having the right person with the corporate knowledge to ask the right questions. And that is a very big difference than just having a translator. There's a lot of questions on this call, and I'm sure there's more about what's happening in New York City. I think that's the healthiest question. And it points us towards a direction that we want you to get involved. In fact, we understand as well that we could do a lot more. So in terms of transparency, we've put a lot more information online for the public to view across all crime categories, but certainly as well with hate crime statistics. So I can remember about a month or two ago getting a presentation of a new dashboard that we put online. And you can go onto that dashboard and look up where in New York City are hate crimes taking place. I don't know if they, Mark, you'll have to follow up, if they drill down to the extent COVID and are they Asian related, but that's something that we can improve upon. So I think the takeaway for me, and I hope many would agree, is that you know, together we are stronger, and we know that there are things that we can certainly improve upon in terms of outreach to the Asian community, whether it's through social media, whether it's through newspaper stories and connecting. And certainly I think this is just a great example of what these two gentlemen have done today as a way to really take that one of those steps towards really bringing community and officers here in the NYPD together. So again, I'll finish with commending both of you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Again, thank you to Commissioner Shea, Deputy Inspector Molinari, and Deputy Inspector Loo for their insightful comments. Thank you all for joining us, over 200 of you, over 20 organizations, for joining what we hope to be a continuing dialogue to improve upon what has been started. And thanks again to the Committee of 100, and especially Committee of 100 member Rick New for starting this effort. So thank you all very much for joining us. I'm sorry we couldn't answer every question in the depth that it requires, but it was a good start to have a discussion and to improve on the program, which the strengths and weaknesses will be known throughout the country in short order. So thank you all very much, and appreciated your attention and your participation. Thank you.
Thank you, Stu. Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.